Delighted you made it your decision to be here tonight. And I encourage you to get a Bible as we talk about some things that relate to the child of God. One of the questions we want to ask tonight is, can a Christian defend himself? It's a question that I've been asked to deal with in two senses. Some time ago, someone asked, could I deal with it in a broad spectrum? And then more recently, more specifically, some things, and we'll talk about that specific in a few moments. Can a Christian defend themselves? Can a Christian defend themselves when they're verbally attacked? Should you be one that when you're verbally attacked, that you respond verbally? I don't mean by that to attack them, but can you respond and defend yourself? Is that okay to do that? Can you defend yourself when you feel that you've been mistreated? You feel like you've been slighted by someone, maybe it's family or someone else, or maybe it's brethren. Can you defend yourself? Can you stand up for your rights? This is my right, I can do this, I have every right to do this, and I'm standing up for my rights. Can you do that? Can you defend yourself when you think that others are taking advantage of you? That you have been abusing me and you've misused me and you're taking advantage of me, and I'm standing up against that. Can I do that? Can you defend yourself when you're physically attacked? Is that possible? Can you do that? So let's talk about when to stand up for yourself. Now, when we talk about that question, I want to begin by suggesting that's a very broad question with many different kinds of applications, and we're going to look at it from a very broad standpoint. Sometimes it might be in the home or in the family where you may need to stand up against your parents, particularly if you're married. Maybe it's your parents who are interfering with the marriage relationship, or maybe it's your in-laws. Can I defend myself against that? Can I stand up and say, this isn't going to happen? Is that right to do that? Or it may be a circumstance, again, with brethren, as we've already mentioned, or it may be your work where you're standing up to your boss or the company or your fellow workers for something that's been said or done. Or again, it may have reference to physical abuse, or maybe a threat that has been made to you, a physical threat that has been made. And again, we talk about rights and liberties. We're going to answer the question in a very general way, and there's going to be some manifold application of that, and you'll see what I mean by that before we get through. Let's define what we mean by stand up against someone or stand up for yourself. We're talking in a broad sense of defending yourself. That does not always mean physical. It can, and we'll talk about that later. Can I respond to what's been said or done to me? That's standing up for yourself. And also, you're letting it be known that you're not going to tolerate some action. You have mistreated me, or you've done wrong, and I'm not going to tolerate that kind of wrongdoing. Or insisting you have the right to do something, or to be something, or making it clear that you've been done wrong. We're looking at it in a very broad spectrum. I want to suggest there are two extremes that neither of which are encouraged in the Scriptures. On the one hand, here's the kind of person that you never want to cross because they are going to respond and they're going to blow up. You say anything to them, they're going to blow up in your face. On the other end of the spectrum is the person who will let you do anything to them, and you're going to be able to walk all over them, run all over them, and they're not ever going to respond. They just kind of play dead and they sit and do nothing. Neither of those extremes are encouraged in the Scriptures, and we're going to avoid those extremes. So let's look at three things. When to stand up for yourself, let's start with this. There is a time when you need to stand up and not bend, but you're going to stand firm. Under what kind of circumstance? Well, we're again going to look at it in a very broad spectrum. So let's start with this. There's a time when truth and right is being attacked. I need to stand up. In Philippians 1 and in verse 17, Paul said, I'm set for the defense of the gospel. I, as a Christian, not merely as a preacher, but as a Christian, must defend the truth of God. And I'm going to defend the truth of God. That doesn't mean I'm always involved in a public debate, but it does mean I stand in defense of what the Bible teaches. And when the Bible is under attack, when truth is under attack, then I'm going to stand up and I'm not going to bend. The same should be true of every one of us. But let's add to that another principle. I'm going to stand and not bend at all when the attack is on me or it's on you, when that attack on us is actually an attack on the truth. How so? Well, I cite two books. I don't give specific verses, but 2 Corinthians and Galatians. Galatians 2, I deal with the entire chapter, but let's just take the book of 2 Corinthians. The book of 2 Corinthians is Paul's defense of himself. But he's not really defending Paul because he's insulted that someone is against Paul. The accusations against Paul were actually an accusation against the truth. You see, all the belittling of Paul's physical looks, or he's not a true apostle, was actually trying to discredit him because of what he taught. So the attacks on Paul were actually an attack on the truth. They're not interested in Paul, they're interested in what he taught. And so sometimes the attack on you, you may be belittled, you may be criticized, you may be ridiculed somehow when it's actually an attack on what you stand for. And so I'm going to stand up and not bend when the attack on me is actually an attack on what I stand for, the truth. But here's a third principle. I must stand up when another is minding my business. Let's look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and in verse 11. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 11, Paul said that you should aspire to live a quiet life, to mind your own business. That's the New King James rendering of that. And here's a Bible principle. We need to mind our own business. And sometimes people need to be told, you need to mind your own business. It's none of your business. And so there are some things that may become quite personal. That's no one else's business. I might need to stand up and say, you know what? That question you're asking or what you're trying to tell me to do or your advice is really none of your business. You have every right to do that. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 5, none of us are to suffer as a busybody. That's in meddling in other people's affairs. That is none of our business. Well, let's go a little bit further. There's a time to stand up and not bend when God's boundaries are crossed. When God's boundaries are crossed. Let me illustrate that in a couple of points. For example, elders have rule over the flock of God that is among them. If elders try to rule beyond the realm where God has given them authority, God's boundaries have been crossed. For example, what if the elders of this church try to rule over another church and tell this church what they need to do? They may need to be reminded, that's none of your concern. You're not telling this church what to do over here. Or it may be, suppose elders try to tell you how to manage your personal life, what you're to buy, the car you're to buy, the house you're to buy, who your friends are to be. I'm not talking about they're trying to advise you to live godly lives, but they're trying to mind your business. Then they're stepping over the jurisdiction that God has given them, and their boundaries are being crossed. I'm going to stand up against that and say, you don't have a right to tell me that. That's none of your concern. Or another illustration of that might be when parents or in-laws are trying to rule over their children. For example, in Matthew 19 and in verse 5, that a man should leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. And so one of the times in which I'm going to stand up and not bend is maybe when parents or in-laws are trying to lord it over or try to rule over those children, telling them what they must and should do. Let's go to Acts chapter 5. Here's another occasion when you've been told to do something that's wrong. In Acts chapter 5 and verse 29, when the apostles were told not to preach anymore, this is a legal authority saying don't do this anymore in this city. Don't preach anymore in the name. And Peter's response was, we must obey God rather than men. He's standing up for himself. He's saying, I'm not going to do that. You tell me not to preach. The Lord told me to preach. I'm going to do what the Lord told me to do. And so it may be your friend, or it may be even a preacher or an elder tells you to do something contrary to the will of God. I must stand up and say, I'm not going to do what you tell me. And so there is a time and a place to stand up. Well, here's another matter. When one has sinned against you, in Luke chapter 17 and in verse 3, if your brother sins against you, you tell him his fault, the text says. Tell him that he has sinned against you in the effort to try to gain your brother. Now, I'm partially quoting from Matthew 18, but Luke 17:3 is talking about the same kind of circumstance. Not parallel passages, but parallel in principle. And so when someone has sinned against you, they've done you wrong, you have every right to stand up and say, you've done wrong. You sinned against me. Now, what we need to do is make sure that we have been done wrong. And I cite 1 Corinthians 13 and in verse 7, it might appear to be wrong, but I need to give them the benefit of the doubt. And that's what 1 Corinthians 13 and in verse 7, believe all things. Give the benefit of the doubt. What I perceive to be wrong may not have actually been wrong. They may not have done what I thought they had done. Now, here's one of the more specifics I've been asked, and so listen carefully as I suggest that we have every right to stand up and not bend and protect life and family. Now let's open our Bibles to Luke chapter 22, if you will. Luke chapter 22. Do I have a right to defend myself physically when I'm physically being attacked? Can I do that? Well, Luke chapter 22, beginning at verse 36, Jesus told his disciples that he that has no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one. Now, we're not through with the context. Let's just stop for a moment. What's he talking about? Well, it's a literal sword. And you say, how do you know it's a literal sword? Biblical hermeneutics suggests that things are to be taken literal unless there's something in the context that demands otherwise. So I ask first, what in the context demands that's some kind of figurative sword like the sword of the Spirit? It doesn't make any sense. There are other things that are obviously literal. For example, look at verse 36. But he who has no money bag, let him take one. Well, that's a literal money bag. And likewise his sack. And notice he says that let him sell his garment. That's a literal garment. Everything else is literal in the context. This is a literal sword. Now, I know it's talking about a literal sword because notice at verse 38, they said, Lord, we have here two swords. And Jesus said, it's enough. So as they went out on their journey, as they went out doing their work, they were encouraged to take a sword. What other purpose would there be for a sword unless it was for self-defense? And chew on that one just for a little bit. But the disciples were allowed to carry a sword. I want to suggest to you that in the Old Testament, you say we're not living under the Old Testament. I well recognize that. But under the Old Testament, God had the prohibition of killing. Thou shalt not kill. We all are familiar with that in Exodus chapter 20. But I want us to go to the next chapter from that. So let's get our Bibles and turn over to Exodus chapter 21. All I'm trying to illustrate, you say we don't live under those passages in Exodus 20. I got that. I understand that. But I'm trying to harmonize Exodus 20 with other texts. That here are passages like Exodus 20, not on the screen, thou shalt not kill. Killing was forbidden, but not all killing was considered in contrast or prohibition of Exodus 20. So how so? Well, let's look at Exodus chapter 21 here in verses 12 to 14. Notice that when he who strikes a man so that he dies, he shall surely be put to death. All right? But now notice at verse 13. If he does not lie in wait, but God delivered him into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place where he may flee. So God drew a difference between premeditated murder and killing that was not premeditated murder. That's all I'm trying to show you is not all killing was considered in violation of Exodus chapter 20. But let's go again to the next chapter. You can chew on Exodus chapter 21 in your own time. So let's go to Exodus chapter 22 now and look at verse 2 to 4. Exodus chapter 22 beginning at verse 2. If a thief be found breaking in, and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. That's interesting, that here is one who is breaking in and he's caught, and if he's killed, I'm going to paraphrase what the text is saying, he is not in violation of Exodus 20, thou shalt not kill. So not all killing was considered murder or in contrast or in violation of Exodus chapter 20. Let's go one more time to Deuteronomy, if you will. Deuteronomy chapter 13. Again, these are Old Testament passages. I will understand that. We don't live under the law. I got that too. But also what I'm trying again, emphasizing, I'm showing these passages were not in disarray with the prohibition of killing. So let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 13. And let's pick up at verse 9. And starting at verse 9, now, I want to back up just a little bit because what he's talking in the context is about apostates. Those that would encourage you, there would be false prophets that say, let's go worship a false god. Let's worship idols. Well, you're not to have anything to do with them. They're to be put to death. Well, what if you're look at verse 6. If your brother or son or mother, etc., or the wife of your bosom, and your friend who is like your own soul, etc., what if they do that and encourage you to go worship other gods? Now notice verse 9. Those are the ones we're speaking of. But you shall surely kill him, and your hand shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. And you shall stone him with stone until he dies. All right, what am I learning? They're to kill him, but that was not in contrast or in violation of thou shalt not kill. That's all I'm trying to illustrate. So do I have a right to defend myself? Well, these passages would seem to suggest that we can. Let's talk a little more about self-defense, since I was asked more specifically to deal with that question. We are not saying nor encouraging that one must defend themselves. And so there are those who say, I couldn't do that. And so if somebody was attacking me, I just have to let them attack me. If that's the way you feel, then let them attack you. I've had people to say to me that I could not defend myself in any shape, form, or fashion. That's fine. And I would just have to let them beat me to death. Well, then let them beat you to death. No one is saying you have to defend yourself. Self-defense does not always involve lethal force. Those who oppose what we'll be talking about here sometimes present only two options, as if there are only two options. Either you stand and do nothing or you use lethal force. I believe there's more between that than those two options. Either stand there and let them kill you, or use lethal force. I'm not saying you couldn't use lethal force, but you say, I can't do that. That doesn't mean you have to stand there and do nothing. For example, there are many ways to defend yourself without lethal force. If one cannot defend themselves, and there are those who make that statement, though they probably mean I can't use lethal force, but they'll word it sometimes, I can't defend myself. I don't believe I can biblically do that. If you can't defend yourself, do you lock your doors at night? By the way, we're going to deal with Matthew 5 in just a moment. If one smacks you on one cheek, you turn the other. We'll deal with that in its context. But if that means that I can't defend myself, does that mean I can't lock the door? And if they're going to come in the back door, I need to unlock the front door so they can come in that one too? Is that what that means? I don't think so. I don't think anybody thinks that. So do you lock your doors at night? And you say, well, yeah, we do that. Well, you're defending yourself. That's self-defense. Could you do this? Could you put up security lights around your house like we have around the building here? Could you put up security cameras as we have here? And many of you have that at your homes. Could you put up a security camera so that you can know if somebody's invading your house? If you're doing that, you're defending yourself. Could you have an alarm system that calls the police? That's self-defense. Could you call the police? You said, I couldn't do anything, but I'll call the police. Well, the police may have to use lethal force when they get there. Here's a person trying to rape you, trying to attack you, and they come. They may have to use lethal force. And you say, well, I wouldn't have been the one that did it, but you by proxy had them to come and do it for you. Could you call the police? Or would you have to say, I couldn't call them because they might use lethal force? Could you push back? In other words, if an attacker is coming, could you just push him back? You say, I'm not going to use a gun, I'm not going to use a bat, I'm not going to use a hammer, I'm not going to use any weapon, but I could push him back. Could you do that? Could you defend yourself? Could you use pepper spray or a Burma gun? If you don't know what a Burma gun is, it shoots pepper balls. Doesn't shoot lead, it shoots pepper balls. Could you do that? Could you shoot that gun at them and just kind of neutralize the circumstance? Doesn't kill them. Doesn't do any permanent damage. Could you do that? That's defending yourself. Could you use pepper spray? Could you do that? Could you defend yourself? There are times that we stand up and we don't bend, we stand up. But there are times that we're not to stand up and we're not to bend. Now, we're shifting gears and we're not talking about defending ourselves physically. It may be included, but let's talk about some other aspects when we don't stand up. We are indeed to bend. In what sense? Well, let's go to Romans 14. We were there this morning. There are times I'm not going to stand up, but rather I'm going to bend when it comes to the point that my liberty or my right causes another person to commit sin. So let's go to Romans chapter 14. Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10. Those are chapters, not verses. Chapters 8, chapter 9, chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians. Both deal with the matter of eating of meats. The only difference is chapter 14 of Romans deals with the eating of meat generally, where chapter 8, 9, and 10 deal with eating of meat that's been sacrificed unto idols. Same principle, though, involved. Let's go to Romans 14 and get the idea, and we'll just forego 1 Corinthians 8. Same concept. Now, Romans 14 talks about eating of meats. The point of Romans 14, you have every right to eat meat, but some opposed that and thought it was wrong and sinful. It would violate their conscience, verse 23. Verse 23 said if it violated their conscience, it's sin for them. So they can't conscientiously do that. Now notice in the context, as we read this morning as we were talking about that we are not to eat or do anything. Look at verse 21. It is good neither to eat meat nor drink wine or do anything by which your brother stumbles or is offended or is made weak. Now the idea of offended in this context means to cause to sin. That's what the word means. And that's what the context shows. It's not offended in the sense I don't like that. I don't like what you're doing. That offends me. I wish you wouldn't do that. But it's the idea that it causes them to violate their conscience, verse 23. Well, let's put some modern day things on that. Some Christians have a problem, say, playing a game that involves the rolling of dice because that's often associated with gambling. So they have a conscience problem. All right, they shouldn't do that. Do I have a right to do that? I think I have a right to do that. But what I'm to do is to forego that right and not do that with them or force them to do that or encourage them to violate their conscience. So there's times I need to bend. That I'm not going to stand up. This is my right. When it causes another person to commit sin. Here's another. When my service or my right or whatever it is I'm standing up for is self-seeking. In James chapter 3, you might turn there just briefly. It talks about wisdom from above versus wisdom from below. Verse 14 says, but if you have bitter envying and self-seeking in your hearts. What's self-seeking? It's the idea it's going to be my way. So here's what I want. Here's my right. But I'm going to insist it be my way, and it's regardless of what you may think or anybody else may think or do. I don't care about you. It's going to be my way or the highway. Then I should not be standing up and defending myself. Let's go to Matthew chapter 5. Now we're going to give a couple of times, we're going to give attention to Matthew chapter 5. When my standing up does other people wrong, we're going to come back and talk about turning the other cheek. I'm not interested in talking about that at this juncture. We'll get to that in a moment. But he said, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's the get even. That's retaliating. Don't do that. And he said, I tell you, resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn him to the other also. And if he compels you to take away your tunic, then you give him his cloak also. We'll explain more about that in a moment. But when my standing up for myself does other people wrong, when I am going to retaliate, we'll say more about that in a moment, then I don't have a right to stand up. I'm not to do them wrong. More about that we'll see in our last section. Now, let's go to Romans chapter 12. Romans chapter 12 talks about how to get along with everybody. That's our brethren and our enemies and the next chapter, the civil government. But in the talking about the enemies, I want you to notice he said at verse 17, repay no one evil for evil, but have regard for good in the sight of all men. And if it's possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Now notice at verse 19, he said, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. When someone's done you wrong, you don't get vengeance. You don't get even, but you give place to wrath. You let God take care of that. Now I cite Romans 13, the whole chapter, and you say, what's that got to do? Because that's the answer to the problem that he just dealt with. He said, don't give place to wrath. That is, because God said, vengeance is mine. That's my place. I'll execute wrath. And one of the ways God does that, the very next chapter shows, through the civil government. Let it be processed through the civil government. And so I might call the police, and they might be arrested, and they might go to jail, and they might go through trial, and they might spend time in prison, and they're doing exactly what Romans chapter 12 said, I'm giving place to wrath. I'm letting God take care of it through the civil government. His tool, verse 4 of Romans chapter 13. Well, here's another thing. When it involves taking another brother to law. Now, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 says that here was a case where some brethren were taking other brethren to law. They were taking them to court. And there are three things that are pointed out in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 1 through 11. The first is you shouldn't go, you should take your problems before the saints, and that is find some wise brethren to help settle the issue without going before the world in court. That's number one. Number two, he said you should be willing, verses 6 and 7, sometimes to suffer wrong rather than take them to court. And then the third thing he points out, beginning at verse 8, is that when you do take them to law, you're doing wrong and you're suffering and or you're endangering your soul. And so that's where he talks about that in verse 9, 10, and 11. So when it involves taking a brother to law, I'm standing up. Maybe I need to stop and bend a little bit rather than stand up for myself. All right, what we've seen so far is there is a time you do stand and you're not going to bend at all. There are times that I don't stand, but I will bend. Here's our third section. What are the principles that help me to determine and govern what the differences are? How do I go about making the decision? This is an occasion where I'm going to bend, and here is an occasion when I'm going to stand firm. How do I make those decisions? How do I make those decisions? Well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about determining the difference, and let's start with this principle. There is nothing wrong with being wronged. There is something wrong with doing wrong. Now, there's a lot of wrongs in that, so let's get that clear. There's something wrong with you doing other people wrong. But there's not a thing wrong with you having been wrong. You haven't done anything sinful if you've been wronged. Now let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and see if that's not what verse 7 is saying. In the context, don't take your brother to law. Notice verse 7 says, now therefore it is already an utter failure for you to go to law against one another. Why do you not rather accept wrong? And why do you not rather let yourselves be defrauded? Wouldn't it be better to suffer wrong and be defrauded than to do someone else wrong? All I'm trying to establish is there's nothing wrong with you being in a position where you've been done wrong. You say, but they did wrong. That's true, but you're not wrong and you're not sinful and you're not disappointing God simply because you've been wronged. So it may be a time I just need to suffer wrong. All right? Here's the second thing. I can't compromise truth or faith. If my bending and bowing and giving in and not standing means I'm giving in and to the truth, and I'm compromising the truth, then I can't do that. I'm to contend earnestly for the faith, Jude verse 3, so I can't compromise truth or faith. Here's a third principle. I must deny myself. That means I say no to myself. I don't always insist on my rights. This is what I want. This is what is for me. Here's a fourth principle. I need to be willing to yield. Let's go to James chapter 3. We were talking about that passage just a few moments ago. And look at verse 14. If you have bitter envying and self-seeking, he said, do not boast and lie against the truth. And notice that at verse 17 is the verse I'm really wanting. But wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield. So if I want to use the wisdom that comes from God, I need to be willing to yield. I give, I bend a little bit. All right? Here's a fourth principle. Now, I said we'd come back to this. Let's talk about turning the other cheek. There comes a time when I need to turn the other cheek. Now, this passage is quite often cited. You don't have a real right to defend yourself if you're being attacked by a robber, you're being attacked by one who wants to murder you, or a rapist, that you could run, but you can't fight back. You can't push back because the Bible says turn the other cheek. Well, we are to turn the other cheek. Let's talk about what this passage is saying. Start at verse 38. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, this is in the text where Jesus is contrasting both Old Testament law with his law and the rabbinical interpretation and the Old Testament law. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, this is his law, do not resist an evil person, and whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. All right, let's go a bit further. We'll come back to verse 39. If anyone wants to sue you to take away your tunic, then you give him a cloak also, and if he compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. And give to him who asks, and from him who wants to borrow, do not turn away. What's Jesus talking about in this context? He's talking about not retaliating. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is retaliating. So someone knocks your eye out, make sure you knock his eye out. Someone shoots at you, you shoot back. Someone steals from you, you steal from them. They punch you in the nose, you punch them in the nose. That's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's retaliating. What Jesus is teaching is not retaliating, a non-retaliatory gospel. Don't retaliate. But I want to say more about verse 39. Notice at verse 39, he said, if he slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Meaning suggest, and perhaps so, by mentioning the right cheek that suggests a backhanded hit, and that it more has reference to an insult. That if he insults you with this backhanded slap, then you turn to him the other also. I don't think that Jesus is saying that if he slaps you on one side, make sure he hits the other side also. Literally do that. If so, if he shoots you on the left shoulder, should you let him shoot and hit you on the right shoulder? Here's the one here. Make sure you hit it. And as I mentioned a moment ago, he breaks in the front door, make sure the back door is unlocked so he gets through there too. Is that what it's saying? No, it's saying it's a non-retaliatory. That is, you don't retaliate. When he shoots at you, that doesn't mean you have to shoot back. When he punches you in the nose, you don't have to punch him back. When he steals from you, you don't steal back. When he hurts your feelings, you don't hurt his feelings back. When he insults you, you don't have to insult him back. It's a non-retaliatory message. That's the idea. And so it is not saying that if he does this, that you've got to turn the other side also, in the sense that you literally, you hit me on the one side of the head, you've got to hit me on the other side too. I'm not walking away. I'm not going to run. I'm not going to hide. I'm going to let you hit me. I don't think that's what Jesus is saying. It's in the context of a non-retaliatory message. But let's go further. How do I determine the difference? There are times I may need to suffer as a Christian. If any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed. In other words, because of my stand, because of my allegiance, I may have to suffer. And I may not have to react at all. Romans 12 and verse 10 said I need to give preference to others. Meaning I'm not just thinking of my own rights, but I'm giving preference to them. What are they thinking? What do they want? Closely connected with that would be passages like 1 Corinthians 9, giving up liberties. Paul did that. Or bearing with one another, Ephesians chapter 4. And one more I want to add to that is long-suffering. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 2 because I want to expand upon long-suffering. Here's a Bible principle I want to expand upon in just for a few moments. That's easy to understand, but it's hard sometimes to practice. Notice at verse 2, with all lowliness of mind, with long suffering, bearing with one another. Let's talk about the context. Verse 3 talks about endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit. Here's the principle of being united in a local church. And one of the ways we do that is have the principles that we agree upon, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, etc. But here are the attitudes that are essential to that. And one of those is the idea of being long-suffering. Ephesians 4 and in verse 2. Now, it literally means to suffer long. That I'm willing to suffer, not always insisting I'm going to stand up, but I'm willing to suffer. It means to be patient and exercise restraint. It suggests, by the very term, a collision of opinions, and there's going to be differing. And so if there's never a time where there's going to be a collision among brethren of opinions and there's some differing, there would be no need for long suffering. That very idea suggests that there's going to be differing of opinions. Barnes captured the thought in several quotes. He said, no virtue perhaps is more frequently demanded in intercourse with others. We do not go far with any fellow traveler on a journey of life before we find this great occasion for its exercise. He has a temperament different from our own. What's he saying? He's saying you don't go very far with fellow travelers till you begin to realize they're different. They got a different temperament that's different from mine. He has his own plans and purposes of life and his own way and time of doing things. He may be naturally irritable, or he may have been so trained that his modes of speech and conduct differ much from ours. And so we're with others that you think, man, they're odd. They're quite odd. They don't do things the way I do. And rightly so. He said we must indulge the friend that we love in the little peculiarities of saying and doing things which may be important to him but may be of little moment to us. Have you ever been around somebody that it's really important to them that it be done this way, or they think this way, and yet that doesn't mean a thing to you? That's what Barnes suggests this is talking about. It's a time for tolerance. I like what the Bible in Basic English translates. Taking whatever comes, putting up with one another, forbearing, putting up with one another. There's going to be collision at times, and we need to be indeed long-suffering. Let's mention how do we govern our stand for ourselves. Let's list a few things and the lesson will be yours. How do I govern my stand for myself? Well, I need to treat others the way I want to be treated. Matthew 7 and in verse 12, you're familiar with the golden rule. Second principle I might come to play is I need to be kind and respectful. That's in that context of Ephesians 4, be kind one to another. I need to be respectful as I'm standing up for myself. I need to be kind and respectful to those I stand up against. I need to be good to those that have done me wrong. I cite Romans chapter 12 and in verse 18. So let's go back to Romans 12 just briefly. This was talking about your enemy, by the way, if we have forgotten that principle. But in Romans 12, you are quite familiar with the wording that if your enemy hungers, you feed him. If he thirsts, you give him drink. For in so doing, you'll heap coals of fire on his head and be not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So what's that saying in context? That I need to be good to those that may be doing me wrong. They may not be treating me right. And so there's a Bible principle for that. Don't violate other laws while standing up. 1 John 3 and verse 4 said a violation of the law is sin. So I don't need to violate any other law of God in standing up for myself. And so I'm going to stand up for my rights. I'm going to stand up for principles of how I've been treated. I don't need to violate any other principle or any other law. And furthermore, I need to be humble. Philippians 2 and in verse 3, I need to bring myself down and humble myself. And furthermore, that love needs to seek the best interest of others. Philippians 2 and in verse 4, look not every man upon his own things, but every man also upon the things of others. Don't just think about yourself, but think how this impacts others. This is my right, this is what I want, but how does this impact someone else? And so that may be a thing that we sometimes tend to forget. Well, that's my feeble effort at trying to answer some questions I've been asked to address. When do you stand up for yourself? Maybe it's a family circumstance where you say, I don't know, should I stand up for myself? Or maybe it's not a family circumstance. Maybe it's a work-related, or maybe it's something in the community or in your neighborhood, or it may be somebody that's threatening you. Maybe a number of ways you want to think, when do I stand up for myself? There is a time to stand up and not bend. There are times not to do that, and here's some principles that help us determine what the difference may be. When do I do that? How do I go about that? May that help us in trying to come to our conclusions. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and repent of your sins and acknowledge your faith and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and sing?